Jack Smith had always been an underdog at Tech Innovate. Despite his dedication and talent, he was constantly overshadowed and mocked by his colleagues. Day after day, he endured the hostile environment, with only a glimmer of hope that his hard work would eventually be recognized. After his latest proposal for a groundbreaking security system was dismissed in a meeting, Jack felt defeated. However, just when it seemed like his career would continue on the same bleak path, an unexpected message from an external consultant changed everything. Jack was given a secret opportunity to prove his worth outside the toxic atmosphere of his office. With this new chance, Jack began working harder than ever, balancing his regular tasks while secretly developing his proposal under the consultant's guidance. Little did he know this opportunity would not only test his skills but also challenge him to navigate the dangerous office politics threatening to ruin everything he had worked for. As the stakes grew higher, Jack's journey of resilience, hope, and ultimate redemption unfolded. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Before we dive into this story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every morning, like clockwork, Jack Smith stepped into Tech Innovate at precisely 8 a.m., just as he had done countless times before. The sleek, cutting-edge design of the company's building and the vibrant energy of the workspace starkly contrasted with the icy, hostile atmosphere he endured daily. He paused for a moment, filling his lungs with air, attempting to steel himself for the barrage of negativity he had come to expect. As he moved past the receptionist flashed her routine, courteous smile, but her eyes quickly returned to the monitor, her disinterest in him almost palpable. In the elevator, he found himself standing beside Sarah from the design department. Sarah wasn't overtly cruel like the others, but she kept her distance, never choosing sides. "Hey, Jack," she greeted him with a timid smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Morning, Sarah. How's everything?" he replied, injecting a forced brightness into his voice that he didn't feel. Good. Ready to tackle another day," she responded, though the slight awkwardness in her tone hinted that she was merely going through the motions. As the elevator reached the 15th floor, it opened with a ding, and before Jack could say another word, Sarah was gone, slipping out as though escaping a conversation she'd rather not have. Jack's heart sank a little, and he let out a quiet sigh before stepping into the office. The familiar sounds of clacking keyboards and low murmurs of colleagues chatting already filled the open office floor. As usual, Jack felt like an outsider in his workspace, as though he were trespassing in a place that would never truly belong to him. But today, something was off. His desk, normally neat and organized, had been turned into a disaster zone. Papers were strewn across the surface, pens scattered in every direction, and the most humiliating sight of all, a dark, wet stain of coffee soaking into his chair. Someone had deliberately knocked over a cup, leaving it to drip down the cushion, marking not just his chair but his pride. "Rough start, Jack? Seems like your coffee had a mind of its own this morning," Rick Matthews' voice cut through the room, loud and sharp with biting sarcasm. A few heads turned, amused smirks spreading as they waited for Jack's reaction. "Careful not to stain your shirt this time," Smith Mark chimed in, his mocking laugh piercing the air, a cruel echo that seemed to stick to Jack's skin. Jack swallowed the lump in his throat, forcing himself to breathe. Without a word, he grabbed some tissues and started wiping the chair. He couldn't afford to let them see how much their taunts affected him. Couldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing how deeply they cut. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 1 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. The familiar rush of heat crept up his neck, his face flushing not from the embarrassment they expected, but from the bubbling anger he fought to contain. It would be so easy to lash out, to throw their words back at them. But he knew better. Experience had taught him that fighting back would only fuel their cruelty, giving them more ammunition to use against him. Early on, Jack had tried standing up for himself, hoping to show them he wasn't an easy target, but that had only backfired. Rick and Mark were experts in twisting his words, warping every response until Jack felt like he was drowning in a sea of humiliation. So he learned to endure, to keep his head down, and pretend the hurtful comments were just background noise. But no matter how hard he tried to stay silent, every sneering joke, every vicious jab felt like a fresh wound. The constant bullying wasn't just a nuisance, it was a relentless assault on his spirit, a slow, painful erosion of his confidence. With each passing day, the weight of their cruelty grew heavier, pressing down on him like an invisible hand tightening around his heart. Though he remained outwardly calm, inside Jack felt like he was slowly breaking, piece by piece, with every mocking laugh chipping away at whatever remained of his resilience. Throughout the morning, Jack tried his best to stay focused on the task at hand. There was no room for distractions. He had a major presentation to finalize. The stakes were high. At 10 a.m., he was expected to present his carefully crafted proposal to William Bryant and the rest of the management team. For weeks, Jack had poured his heart and soul into this project, a detailed plan to overhaul the company's data security system, one that promised to save millions in operational costs. He knew his research was solid, and his ideas could make a real difference. But he also understood the uphill battle he was about to face. Presenting at Tech Innovate had always been more about navigating egos than sharing ideas. As he fine-tuned the final slides, his email pinged with a new message from William Bryant, meeting at 10 a.m. in Conference Room 3. Bring the optimization proposal. Jack stared at the screen, reading the message over and over, as if searching for some hidden meaning in the brief, impersonal lines. William had never been particularly warm toward him, and Jack knew his boss was often skeptical of his ideas, but this was his chance, perhaps his only one, to prove himself yet again. No matter the obstacles, he had to try. He made some last-minute tweaks to the presentation, ensuring the numbers were precise and the narrative was as clear as possible. His mind raced through every possible question or challenge that might come his way. He was determined to be ready for anything. When the clock hit 9:55, Jack took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and grabbed his briefcase. As he walked toward the conference room, the hallway seemed to stretch out endlessly before him, each step growing heavier under the crushing weight of expectation. It wasn't just the pressure he felt, but the silent anticipation from his colleagues, many of whom expected, perhaps even hoped, that he would fail. Arriving at the conference room, Jack opened the door to find William, Rick, Mark, and Sarah already seated, engaged in a low-voiced conversation. The moment Jack entered, William cast a glance his way, offering a quick nod for him to take his place at the table. "Good morning, everyone," William began in his no-nonsense tone, barely looking up from his notes. "Let's get straight to it. Jack, I believe you have a proposal for the optimization project. We're eager to hear what you've come up with." Jack's palms were slightly damp as he stood up, masking his nerves with as much composure as he could muster. "Thank you, sir," he replied, his voice steady but his heart pounding in his chest. He connected his laptop to the projector, the slides lighting up the room. He started his presentation, carefully walking the team through each point. His voice grew more confident as he explained how improving the company's security system could streamline operations, cut costs, and improve efficiency. But despite his best efforts to stay focused, Jack couldn't ignore the unsettling distractions. Rick and Mark sat near the back, exchanging knowing glances and whispering to each other, clearly more interested in mocking him than listening. Their barely contained smirks were like needles, pricking his already fragile confidence, but he pressed on, doing his best to block them out and concentrate on William, whose face remained as inscrutable as ever. Jack couldn't tell whether his boss was impressed or completely uninterested. Halfway through the presentation, Rick abruptly cut him off. "Wait a second, Jack. All this sounds good on paper, but realistically this would be a logistical nightmare. Do you honestly think this solution is feasible?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Jack. He could feel his pulse quicken, but he took a moment to compose himself before responding. "Yes, Rick. I've analyzed the data extensively, and with the right strategic planning." Rick cut him off again, this time with a dismissive laugh. "Planning, sure. But did you factor in the additional costs? Implementing this could easily end up costing more than what we're already doing. Did you even consider that?" Jack swallowed hard, fighting to keep his cool. "I did account for the costs, and while there are upfront expenses, the long-term savings will far outweigh." But Rick wasn't interested in listening. He leaned back in his chair, his expression smug, as if he had already won the argument. The others in the room, including Mark, seemed to feed off Rick's condescension, and Jack could feel the tide turning against him. Despite the data, despite the facts, it seemed no one wanted to give him a fair chance. As Jack stood there, holding back the frustration that threatened to boil over, he realized this wasn't just a critique of his proposal. It was a test of his resolve, a challenge to his very presence in the company. He had come prepared with every detail, but no amount of preparation could defend him from the unspoken judgment that lingered in the air, that unyielding resistance to his ideas simply because they came from him. And no matter how many times he tried to prove himself, that invisible wall between him and his colleagues seemed as solid as ever. The long-term costs would be significantly reduced, Jack replied, his voice calm despite the surge of anger building inside. He had worked tirelessly on this, and he wasn't about to let it be dismissed without a fight. I conducted a thorough cost analysis, and... "Oh, your analysis," Rick interjected once more, turning his attention toward William, his tone dripping with condescension. "William, these kinds of theoretical analyses are fine for classrooms and textbooks, but what we need here is something practical, something that can work in the real world." William nodded in agreement, as though Rick's words had already sealed the deal. "Rick brings up a valid point," Jack Williams said, his tone neutral but final. "Sometimes the simplest solution is the best one. Your proposal is interesting, but we need something more feasible, something we can implement without too much disruption." Frustration welled up inside Jack like a rising tide. He had poured his heart into this project, sacrificing hours and missing out on weekends, all in the belief that he was creating something valuable. Now his work was being brushed aside, not because it wasn't good, but because no one was willing to give it a fair shot. "Sir, if I could just explain a bit more, show you the detailed breakdown of..." Smith William interrupted sharply, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We've already made our decision. We'll be moving forward with Rick's approach. Maybe we can explore your idea on a smaller scale at some point. For now, focus on your other responsibilities." It felt like a punch to the gut. Jack had expected resistance, but this complete dismissal was worse than he imagined. His shoulders slumped slightly as he replied, "Understood, sir." His voice was quiet and restrained, masking the crushing sense of defeat gnawing at him. William gave him a curt nod, signaling the end of the conversation, and turned back to his notes as if Jack no longer existed in the room. Jack rose from his chair, feeling the weight of failure pressing down on him, grabbed his briefcase, and left the conference room. The entire meeting had been a disaster, not because his idea wasn't good, but because once again, his voice had been silenced before he even had a real chance to speak. No matter how much effort he put in, it always seemed like his contributions were invisible to those in power. Back at his desk, Jack tried to refocus on his work, but the humiliation from the meeting hung over him like a dark cloud, impossible to shake. The sting of being overlooked, dismissed without a second thought, gnawed at him, threatening to pull him under. Nearby, Rick and Mark stood by the coffee machine, their voices loud enough to carry across the office. Jack didn't need to turn around to know they were talking about him. "Did you see his face? Poor guy thought he was going to save the company," Rick sneered, his words filled with mocking amusement. "Yeah," Mark chimed in with a laugh. "He's got to learn he's not the genius he thinks he is." Their laughter cut through the air like shards of glass, each word a painful reminder of how little he was valued here. Jack kept his eyes glued to his monitor, pretending to type, though his mind was elsewhere. He tried to block out their voices, but it was no use. Their mocking, their cruel words only deepened the sense of isolation that had been building inside him for months. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 2 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Jack knew with painful clarity that he was an outsider here. No matter how hard he worked or how good his ideas were, he was never truly welcome. He felt like an intruder in a place that had never accepted him, where his presence was merely tolerated, not respected. Each day at Tech Innovate was a reminder of that fact, a slow, suffocating erosion of his spirit that left him feeling more alienated and alone with every passing moment. As the day crawled toward its end, Jack stood up from his desk, heading to the restroom in hopes of finding a brief moment of solitude. But as he walked down the hallway, The sound of muffled laughter trailed behind him. This time, it wasn't Rick or Mark, it was a group of interns. People who barely knew him but had already picked up on the office culture of ridicule. "Hey, did you hear? Jack's going to save the company. Maybe he'll pull it off right before they fire him," one of them quipped, followed by a loud burst of laughter. Jack quickened his pace, his heart pounding, as if he could physically outrun the cruel remarks that seemed to follow him everywhere. The walls felt like they were closing in, every corner of that building a reminder of his isolation. When he returned to his desk, there was a message waiting for him. It was from Sarah. "Jack, can we talk for a minute?" He stared at the screen, his finger hovering over the reply button, uncertainty gnawing at him. Was this another setup? Just another way to make him feel small? But what did he have left to lose at this point? He agreed to meet her. They met in the small, dimly lit break room, a space meant for casual coffee breaks, but now feeling more like an interrogation room. A few chairs and a coffee table were scattered around, and the hum of the vending machine was the only sound. Sarah stood there, looking uneasy, almost as if she regretted asking him to come. Her nervousness only deepened Jack's suspicion. He crossed his arms, bracing himself for whatever was coming next. "Jack, I saw what happened in the meeting," Sarah began softly, her voice filled with hesitation. Her eyes held a sadness, an apology that seemed too late. "I'm sorry for you." Jack sighed. The words, though well-intentioned, felt empty. He had heard it all before. "Thanks, Sarah, but let's be honest, it doesn't change anything, does it?" His tone was weary, the weight of the day evident in his voice. Apologies couldn't undo the damage, couldn't erase the humiliation or the isolation he endured daily. "I know," Sarah admitted, her eyes dropping to the floor, her discomfort palpable. "But I just wanted you to know that not everyone here is like Rick and Mark. I've seen how hard you work. I know you're good at what you do." Jack forced a smile, though it barely reached his eyes. "It's nice to know someone notices," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. Her words, though kind, felt like too little, too late. Sarah bit her lip, clearly uncomfortable with the tension between them. "I just wanted you to know I'm on your side," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Even if it doesn't always seem that way." Jack nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. He appreciated her attempt at kindness, but it did little to soothe the gnawing sense of alienation that had been building inside him for so long. He thanked her, more out of politeness than genuine gratitude, and excused himself, returning to his desk with the same heavy feeling he had carried all day. Kind words couldn't change the cruel reality of his daily life at Tech Innovate. They couldn't erase the snide comments, the mocking laughter, or the constant feeling of being an outsider in a place where he didn't belong. When Jack finally stepped out of the office, the night had already settled over the city. The streets of New York were alive with their usual chaotic energy, honking cars, people rushing by, and the constant hum of life moving forward. Yet, despite the crowd, Jack had never felt more alone. It was as if the world around him was moving in a different rhythm, leaving him behind in a cloud of despair. He made his way toward the subway station, his footsteps heavy with the burden of the day. No matter how hard he tried to push it away, the voices from the office followed him, their cruel laughter and cutting remarks echoing in his mind like a broken record. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how much effort he put in, no matter how much of himself he sacrificed, he would never truly belong in that place. As the train rumbled toward the platform, he wondered how much longer he could endure the weight of a life that felt so far from the one he had imagined. As Jack waited for the subway, he caught a glimpse of himself in the reflection of the station's glass. The face staring back at him was one worn down by the relentless struggles of a man fighting to stay upright in a world that seemed determined to push him down. Dark circles lined his tired eyes, his shoulders slumped under the weight of constant rejection. His mind was buzzing with thoughts, each one laced with frustration. "I need a change," he thought, the words settling like a stone in his chest. The cycle of humiliation and disdain at Tech Innovate was suffocating him, and he knew that if he didn't find a way out soon, he'd be stuck in this hopeless loop forever. Just as he turned away from the glass, his phone vibrated in his pocket. Startled, Jack pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A new message, this time from an unknown number external consultant meeting request. Mr. Smith, I am an external consultant hired by Tech Innovate to evaluate the company's internal dynamics. I would like to discuss your recent presentation and any additional ideas you may have. Could we schedule a private meeting? Please respond with your availability. Jack blinked at the screen, reading the message again and again, as if waiting for the words to change. His heart skipped a beat, a mix of disbelief and cautious curiosity flooding his mind. Who is this consultant, and why are they interested in me? The question swirled in his head. He had no idea who this person was, but one thing was crystal clear: this might be his chance, a real chance. Without hesitation, he quickly typed out a response, agreeing to meet and suggesting a time for the next day. As the subway pulled up, Jack stepped into the car with a glimmer of hope lighting up a small corner of his heart. It was fragile, like a flickering candle in the wind, but it was there. Maybe, just maybe, this meeting could be the turning point he had been waiting for, a chance to finally step out from the shadows and prove his worth, the worth that he knew existed but had been buried under layers of scorn and mockery from his colleagues. That night, Jack barely slept. His mind was a whirlwind of replayed moments from the disastrous meeting, each taunt and jab echoing in his head like a broken record. But amidst the darkness, the thought of the upcoming meeting with the consultant kept him afloat. It was the only thing that stopped him from sinking deeper into frustration and bitterness. This meeting wasn't just another task on his schedule, it was a lifeline. The next morning, Jack was up before his alarm even had the chance to go off. He got ready quickly, his mind sharper than it had been in days. The crisp morning air hit him as he stepped outside, the cold biting into his skin but waking him up in a way that felt almost refreshing. As he approached Tech Innovate, the sleek building that had come to symbolize his daily torment loomed ahead, but today it didn't feel quite as suffocating. He walked inside, past the reception desk where the receptionist didn't even glance up from her screen, and headed straight for the elevator. He tried to ignore the sinking feeling in his gut, the familiar dread of another day spent navigating the minefield that was his workplace. On the 15th floor, the office was already buzzing with the usual activity. The clicking of keyboards, the hum of conversations, it all felt like background noise to Jack as he made his way to his desk. He could feel eyes on him, the judgment from his colleagues palpable, like invisible hands pushing him further into the role they had cast him in, the perpetual failure. Of course, Rick Matthews couldn't let the moment pass without a comment. Well, look who decided to show up, the innovation genius himself. Rick's voice cut through the room, dripping with sarcasm. His smile was smug, barely masking the malice beneath it. Ready to bless us with another one of your brilliant ideas? Mark, sitting across the room, didn't miss a beat. He laughed loudly, leaning back in his chair, as if the entire scene was a source of endless amusement. Yeah, maybe this time you'll even impress William. Who knows, Jack? He might give you a second chance. Jack clenched his jaw, the familiar wave of anger rising within him, but he didn't let it show. He'd learned long ago that reacting to their taunts only fueled their cruelty. Instead, he kept his head down, moving to his desk with purpose, focusing on what mattered: the meeting. His mind raced ahead, playing through scenarios, trying to stay focused on the opportunity that lay before him. He couldn't afford to let Rick or Mark, or even the sting of past failures, derail him now. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity as he waited for the meeting time to arrive. But amidst the tension, that small spark of hope remained. This consultant might be the key to something new, something better. Jack wasn't naive enough to believe that one meeting could solve all his problems, but it was a step toward something different, toward being heard, toward the change he so desperately needed. Jack didn't reply to Rick or Mark. He kept his eyes fixed on the screen as his computer powered up, trying to steady his trembling hands. Any retort would only invite more mockery, and he had no interest in starting the day with another argument. Today, he needed to stay composed, to keep his focus on the upcoming meeting with the consultant. This could be his one chance to find an escape from the suffocating atmosphere he had been enduring. At exactly 10 a.m., the phone on his desk rang. It was Sarah. "Jack, the consultant is waiting for you in meeting room 5. "Thanks," Sarah Jack replied, doing his best to mask the anxiety in his voice. He hung up the phone and grabbed his briefcase, making sure his papers were in order before standing. A mix of nervousness and anticipation swirled inside him as he headed down the hallway. Meeting room 5 was at the far end of the office, away from the usual bustle. It was a small, private space ideal for the type of discussion Jack hoped would take place. His heart raced with each step, the weight of this opportunity pressing down on him. When he finally opened the door, he found a tall man in a dark suit seated at the table. The consultant exuded professionalism, his expression serious, but there was a softness in his eyes that took Jack by surprise. It was as though this man, unlike everyone else at Tech Innovate, was willing to listen. The man stood up and extended his hand. "Mr. Smith, I'm Edward Allen. I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me," he said, his handshake firm but welcoming. Jack hesitated for just a second before shaking his hand. "It's a pleasure, Mr. Allen. I have to admit, I'm a bit curious about what brought you to me." Edward smiled slightly and gestured for Jack to sit. "I understand. I'm here to assess some of the internal dynamics at Tech Innovate, particularly how ideas are being communicated and implemented. I was made aware of yesterday's meeting and your proposal. I'd like to hear more from you directly if you're willing to share." Jack settled into the chair, still trying to make sense of the situation. Edward Allen was an external consultant with an impressive reputation, someone with the power to influence change within the company. But why would he take an interest in a proposal that had already been dismissed by the higher-ups? It didn't add up. "Well, sir, I spent a significant amount of time developing that proposal." Jack began carefully, his voice measured. He wasn't sure how much to reveal yet. The goal was to improve our data security system's efficiency while cutting down on operational costs. I ran detailed analyses and projections that showed promising results, but he paused, choosing his words with caution. "Management didn't seem to agree with my findings." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And what do you think went wrong? From your perspective, why did they dismiss it?" Jack took a deep breath, thinking back to the tension in the conference room, the mocking whispers, the way Rick and Mark had undermined him. "It's not that the data or the analysis was flawed," he said, his frustration evident. "I believe it was more about the politics in the room. Some voices carry more weight than others here, regardless of the substance behind the ideas. And when people like Rick or Mark speak up, it's difficult for anyone else to get a fair hearing." Edward leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on Jack, showing genuine interest. "That's exactly what I want to understand. You've put in the work, and it sounds like you have a solid proposal, but there's more at play. Tell me more about the dynamics you're referring to. How does that affect the flow of innovation here?" Jack's heart pounded. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone was not only listening to him but asking the right questions. He took a moment to collect his thoughts before continuing. "There's a culture here unspoken, but obvious, where certain individuals dominate the conversation. They shut down ideas before they even have a chance to be fully explored. It's frustrating, especially when you know your work could make a difference, but you're sidelined by personal biases or office politics." Edward nodded again, making notes on a pad in front of him. "And how does that affect your ability to contribute? How does it shape the environment for others like you who may be facing the same obstacles?" Jack leaned back slightly, the weight of the question settling on him. "It makes it hard to stay motivated. After a while, you start to wonder if it's even worth it. It's not just me. I've seen others with great ideas get shut down or ignored because they're not part of the inner circle. It's like fighting a losing battle every day." Edward set down his pen, his expression thoughtful. "Jack, thank you for your honesty. I can tell you care deeply about the work you do, and it's clear that the current environment isn't allowing people like you to thrive. That's exactly why I'm here, to get to the bottom of why innovation is being stifled and how we can exacting." Jack felt a small flicker of hope ignite. For the first time, someone was validating his experience, acknowledging that the problem wasn't just his failure to fit in, but a systemic issue within the company. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "It's just been difficult to find a way forward when every door seems closed." If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 3 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Edward smiled, a reassuring look in his eyes. You're not alone in feeling that way. Change takes time, but it starts with conversations like this. I'd like to work with you to explore your ideas further. I believe there's potential here that's been overlooked, and I want to help you bring it to light. Jack blinked, unsure if he was hearing this. Was this finally the moment he had been waiting for, the moment someone saw his worth? I'd be grateful for that, he said, his voice filled with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. As they wrapped up the meeting, Jack walked out of the room with a sense of relief and cautious optimism. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a new chapter, a chance to finally escape the shadows and show his true potential. For the first time in a long while, he felt like the world wasn't closing in on him. Instead, it felt like a door was finally opening. Edward nodded, his eyes locked on Jack as if searching for something deeper beneath the surface. That's what concerns me, Mr. Smith. Could you show me your analysis? Jack hesitated for a brief moment before reaching into his briefcase and pulling out the documents he had spent weeks perfecting. He handed them over to Edward, his palms slightly damp from anxiety. As the consultant began to flip through the pages, the room fell into a tense silence. Jack could feel his heart pounding, every second that passed heightening his uncertainty. He had no idea what would come of this meeting, whether this was his big break or just another dead end. After what felt like an eternity, Edward set the papers down on the table and looked up, meeting Jack's gaze with an intensity that made Jack sit up straighter. Your proposal is solid, Mr. Smith, Edward began, his voice calm but firm. You've thought through all the important details, and I can see you've accounted for the potential challenges. Frankly, I'm impressed with the quality of your work. Jack blinked, caught off guard by the compliment. Praise was something he rarely heard at Tech Innovate, especially from someone in a position of authority. He wasn't sure how to respond, so he simply muttered, "Thank you, sir. I'm glad you found it worthwhile." But a question nagged at the back of his mind. He hesitated, then decided to ask what had been eating at him since the start of the meeting. "But if you don't mind me asking, why are you so interested in this? Why me?" Edward's expression softened, but there was a trace of sadness in his smile, as though he'd seen this kind of situation before. "Because, Mr. Smith, I've been doing this for a long time, and I've seen companies like Tech Innovate waste the potential of valuable talent like yours. And I believe that's something that shouldn't be ignored." Jack's emotions swirled. Gratitude mingled with suspicion. He wasn't accustomed to this kind of attention, especially from someone with as much influence as Edward. A small voice in his mind warned him to be cautious after all. He'd learned the hard way that good intentions weren't always as pure as they seemed. Edward leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "I'd like to take your proposal to the next level. What I'm proposing is to implement it in a pilot project, one that I'll oversee directly. You'd be working outside your current department and, at least for a time, out of sight of William Bryant and his team." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline, but Jack hesitated. This was a major decision. The opportunity was more than he could have hoped for, but it came with risks. If he agreed to work under Edward, he'd be stepping outside the safety, albeit a hostile one, of his current role, and being removed from William's sight could carry consequences. Jack wasn't sure if Edward was being completely transparent about his motivations, or if this was just another corporate game with him as a pawn. Sensing his internal struggle, Edward leaned back and gave Jack a knowing look. "I know it's not an easy decision," he said gently, "but I want you to understand something. I see a lot of potential in you, Mr. Smith. The kind of potential that others here are too blind or too biased to recognize. I don't want to see that potential wasted." Jack remained silent, his mind racing. He had been waiting for someone to see his worth for so long, for someone to acknowledge the effort and intelligence he poured into his work. And now, here was Edward, offering him a chance to prove himself away from the toxic environment that had suffocated him for years. But was Edward's offer genuine, or was there something more beneath the surface? Jack finally spoke, his voice tentative but steady. "What happens if this doesn't work out? If William finds out, or if the project fails, what then?" Edward's expression remained calm. but his voice was resolute. "You're not alone in this. I'm here to make sure it doesn't fail. And if it does, I'll take responsibility. But I have faith in your work, Jack. You've done the hard part, now it's time to give it the platform it deserves." Jack's heart raced. The opportunity was there, waiting for him to reach out and grab it. He had always been cautious, too aware of the pitfalls of corporate politics, but maybe this was his moment to take a risk. He looked at Edward, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like someone truly believed in him. After a long pause, Jack nodded slowly. "I'm willing to take that chance, Mr. Allen. Let's do it." Edward's smile widened, this time filled with genuine warmth. "Good. Let's get started." Those words, spoken with such conviction, ignited something deep within Jack. For the first time in years, he felt truly seen, not as a disposable employee, but as someone with potential and worth. "I accept," Jack replied, the words almost surprising him as they left his lips. He had never been one to take big risks, but something about Edward's belief in him gave him the courage he needed. "I'm willing to work with you on this project." Edward nodded, a satisfied gleam in his eyes. "Great. Let's get started right away. I'll handle everything on my end to ensure your transition is as smooth as possible. You'll continue with your usual responsibilities at Tech Innovate, but for anything related to this project, you'll report directly to me." Excitement surged through Jack, mingled with a sense of apprehension. He was stepping into unfamiliar territory, one that carried both immense potential and significant risk. But more than anything, he was eager to finally prove what he was capable of. "One last thing, Mr. Smith," Edward said, stopping Jack just as he was about to leave. "I think it's best we keep this between us for now. There's no need to create any unnecessary friction with management until we have some solid results to show." Jack nodded, fully understanding the need for discretion. "I understand, sir. I'll keep it confidential." As Jack returned to his desk, a sense of purpose filled him. This was a new chapter, a chance he had never thought he'd get at Tech Innovate. But alongside that excitement came a nagging tension. The secrecy, the stakes, and the potential consequences if William or anyone else found out what he was doing weighed heavily on his mind. He was walking a dangerous line, but it was a risk he was willing to take. The following days were some of the most intense Jack had ever experienced. His work on the pilot project with Edward consumed him. Every spare moment was spent reviewing data, analyzing potential risks, and ensuring the proposal was flawless. It was demanding, but Jack thrived under the pressure. He was more focused than he had been in years. At the same time, he had to maintain his usual tasks and appearances to keep the rest of the office from suspecting anything. Rick and Mark continued with their daily taunts, but Jack found it easier to ignore them. He had something much bigger to focus on now, something that could change everything. One afternoon, while Jack was engrossed in one of the reports for the pilot project, Sarah approached his desk. She seemed nervous, glancing around to make sure no one was paying attention before speaking in a hushed tone. "Jack, can I talk to you for a minute?" Jack looked up, feeling a spike of anxiety but trying to mask it with a calm expression. "Of course, Sarah. What's going on?" She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room again before leaning in closer. I heard you're working on something with the external consultant. Is it true?" Jack's heart skipped a beat. He froze for a moment, weighing his options. He didn't want to lie to Sarah, especially after her show of support, but he also knew how delicate the situation was. "Yes, Sarah," he admitted quietly. "I'm working on a pilot project with him. But this must stay between us for now. It's something that needs to be kept quiet." Sarah nodded, her concern apparent. "I get it, Jack. I wanted to warn you to be careful. If management finds out, things could get messy. You know how this place is." "I know the risks," Jack replied, his voice steady with determination. "But this is an opportunity I can't afford to pass up. It's my chance to finally prove myself." Sarah's lips curled into a small smile, though the worry in her eyes didn't disappear. "Just take care of yourself, okay? I don't want to see you get hurt in all this. I'm rooting for you, Jack. I am." Jack nodded, touched by her words. "Thanks, Sarah. That means a lot." As she walked away, Jack returned to his work, but Sarah's warning echoed in his mind. He knew she was right. Things could easily spiral out of control if the wrong people found out about the project. But despite the risks, Jack was resolute. This was his moment, and he was ready to fight for it, no matter the consequences. "Thanks, Sarah. That means a lot to me," Jack replied, feeling a flicker of warmth amidst the cold, unwelcoming environment he had grown accustomed to. As the days passed, Jack found himself increasingly consumed by the secret project with Edward, while still juggling his regular duties at Tech Innovate. The tension mounted with each passing day, a constant reminder that one wrong move could lead to catastrophic consequences. His career was already fragile, and any slip-up could mean not only his exit from Tech Innovate but also an even deeper humiliation than he had already endured. Finally, the moment arrived, the first major milestone of the project. Jack and Edward were ready to present the preliminary results of their pilot program. It was a critical meeting, one that had to be conducted with extreme discretion. Edward had carefully selected a small, trusted group of investors and strategic partners for the presentation, ensuring that it would fly under the radar of Tech Innovate's management. Jack knew this was his moment, his chance to prove himself and show the world what he was capable of. On the morning of the presentation, Jack woke up earlier than usual, his stomach churning with anxiety. Everything hinged on this day: his career, his self-worth, and the recognition he had been yearning for. When he arrived at the presentation venue, a small, nondescript conference room in a downtown building, Edward was already there, speaking with two men Jack didn't recognize. He entered the room with a mixture of nervousness and determination. "Gentlemen, this is Jack Smith, the brains behind our new security solution," Edward said, gesturing toward Jack with a sense of pride. Jack felt a wave of both pride and anxiety upon hearing the introduction. Never before had someone spoken about him with such respect and acknowledgement. Taking a deep breath, Jack launched into his presentation, explaining the intricate details of the project and walking the investors through his thought process, the potential benefits, and the cost savings. As he spoke, Jack noticed the investors' attentive gazes and their thoughtful nods. Their questions were sharp, but they came from a place of genuine interest, unlike the dismissive scrutiny he had endured at Tech Innovate. With each answer, Jack felt his confidence growing. Edward stood beside him, watching with approval, which only fueled Jack's drive to deliver the best presentation of his life. When the presentation concluded, the investors exchanged glances, and then one of them stood and shook Jack's hand firmly. "This is impressive, Mr. Smith. Impressive. We're eager to see where this project goes." Jack felt a surge of relief and satisfaction. It was the validation he had been yearning for, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had truly accomplished something meaningful. His work was valued, and for once it seemed like his career had a future worth fighting for. But Jack knew this was only the beginning. There was still a long road ahead, and the burden of keeping the project a secret weighed heavily on him. The stakes were higher than ever, and any slip could bring everything crashing down. Back at the office, the contrast between his professional triumph and the hostile environment at Tech Innovate was stark. He was mentally exhausted from the presentation but also energized by the momentum of the project. Still, he couldn't ignore the creeping tension that seemed to intensify with each passing day. Rick and Mark continued to cast curious, suspicious glances his way, clearly sensing that something had changed. And they were right. Jack was no longer the timid, beaten-down version of himself. There was a quiet confidence in his demeanor now, an energy they couldn't quite place. It irritated them. Since the pilot presentation, the taunts from Rick and Mark only escalated. Although they had no idea about the secret project, they could sense something was different. Perhaps it was Jack's new sense of purpose, or the fact that despite their constant efforts to bring him down, he remained standing. But this newfound confidence was constantly tested. Jack was well aware that he was walking a tightrope. One misstep, and everything could unravel. One morning, as Jack sat at his desk reviewing data for the pilot project, Rick sauntered over with a smirk plastered across his face. He leaned casually against Jack's desk, his arms crossed, his expression laced with cynicism. "So, Smith," Rick drawled, "what's going on?" "I've noticed you've been pretty busy lately." His tone was smug, as though he already knew something Jack didn't want him to. Jack felt his muscles tense, but forced himself to stay calm. "Just doing my job, like always," he replied, his voice steady but his discomfort growing. "Really?" Rick leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing as he pretended to peer at Jack's computer screen. "Because it seems like you're involved in something big, something you're keeping from the rest of us." His voice dripped with insinuation, as though he were trying to provoke Jack into revealing something. Jack took a deep breath, keeping his gaze focused on the screen in front of him. "Just working on the usual projects," Ricky said evenly, resisting the urge to lash out. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 4 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Rick studied him for a moment longer, clearly unsatisfied with Jack's response but not having enough information to push further. With a snide chuckle, he straightened up. "Well, keep up the good work, Smith. We're all watching," he said, his voice laced with veiled mockery before walking away. As soon as Rick was out of sight, Jack exhaled slowly. He knew the game he was playing was becoming more dangerous by the day. The tension at Tech Innovate was thick, and with Rick sniffing around, it felt like only a matter of time before something gave. But despite the growing risk, Jack wasn't willing to back down. This project was his chance, his one opportunity to finally rise above the doubt and prove that he was worth more than the ridicule and scorn, and he would see it through, no matter what came next. Jack's heart raced as Rick's words lingered in the air, but he forced himself to keep his expression neutral. "I'm just working on some reports for William, nothing you need to worry about." Rick chuckled lowly, his eyes gleaming with thinly veiled suspicion. Sure," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "It's just funny how you suddenly have all this important work. But hey, don't worry, Smith. If you need help figuring anything out, I'm always around." Jack gave a curt nod, knowing that engaging further would only give Rick more ammunition. As Rick finally sauntered away, Jack exhaled quietly, relieved to have escaped another confrontation. But the feeling of being constantly watched, of being under a microscope, never left him. The walls of Tech Innovate seemed to close in tighter with each passing day. The days blurred together, a careful balancing act as Jack meticulously worked on the secret project with Edward, while maintaining the facade of irregular duties. Every detail of the project had to be flawless, yet Jack couldn't afford to slip up with his day-to-day tasks at Tech Innovate. Rick and Mark were always hovering, their curiosity growing with each passing day, and the weight of secrecy began to take a toll on Jack. The pressure of living a double life was exhausting, and there were moments when he wondered how much longer he could keep it up. One afternoon, Jack sat in a routine department meeting where William was reviewing the progress of various ongoing projects. It was the same monotonous drill, William speaking, the team nodding in agreement, and Jack keeping his head down, avoiding the spotlight as much as possible. "Rick, how's the progress on the optimization project?" William asked, his gaze still fixed on the documents in front of him, not even glancing in Jack's direction. Rick leaned forward in his chair, a smug smile creeping across his face. "We're making solid progress, William. A few things still need refining, but overall, we're moving forward." "Good," William responded flatly, his lack of enthusiasm apparent. He then turned his gaze toward Jack, making him tense up. "And you, Smith? Anything to add?" The room seemed to be still as all eyes turned toward Jack. He could feel the weight of their scrutiny, their anticipation for him to slip up, to say something that would give them a reason to tear him down. He knew William wasn't looking for input, but the slightest mistake would be seized upon by Rick and Mark. Jack kept his voice steady, his face impassive. "Nothing to add, sir. Just focused on my daily tasks." William gave a brief nod of acknowledgement and moved on to another topic. Jack felt a small wave of relief wash over him, but he could still sense Rick and Mark's eyes lingering on him. They were watching him closely, looking for any cracks in his armor, for any sign of what he might be hiding. Jack knew he had to remain vigilant. One misstep could unravel everything he had worked so hard to build. As the pilot project progressed, Jack found himself spending more and more time away from the office, meeting with Edward in discreet locations to discuss the next phases. These meetings, conducted in quiet coffee shops or rented conference rooms, were filled with tension, but also a growing sense of excitement. For the first time in years, Jack was working on something meaningful, something that had the potential to change not only his career but his entire life. Each meeting with Edward reinforced the importance of their project and heightened Jack's resolve. But the deeper he went, the more the stakes grew. The exhilaration of working on something clandestine, something with real value, was tempered by the constant fear of discovery. He knew that if anyone at Tech Innovate, especially William, caught wind of what he was doing, the consequences could be devastating. Yet, despite the risks, Jack couldn't help but feel a strange euphoria coursing through him. He was finally being recognized for his abilities, finally able to contribute to something larger than the petty office politics that had weighed him down for so long. But as that sense of fulfillment grew, so did the tension. He was walking a tightrope, and he knew it wouldn't take much for the entire balancing act to come crashing down. As Jack continues to navigate the high-stakes world of corporate politics, balancing secrecy and ambition, it's clear that the journey isn't just about career growth, it's about resilience, perseverance, and knowing when to take calculated risks. But now we turn it over to you. What have you learned from Jack's story so far? Have you faced similar challenges in your own life where you had to tread carefully to achieve something meaningful? We'd love to hear from you. Comment below on one lesson you've learned from this journey and how you plan to apply it to your life. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life.